My daughter stood up at the head of my dining table, lifted her glass, and smiled at 18 people like she had already won. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice bright and warm, and absolutely certain. Everyone raised their glasses. My son-in-law raised his highest. I did not raise mine. I reached under my chair instead, and I pulled out a plain manila folder, and I set it on the tablecloth between the turkey and the cranberry sauce. The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in pieces. First the far end, where my grandson stopped mid-sentence. Then the middle, where my sister-in-law lowered her fork. Then finally my daughter, whose smile stayed on her face a full 3 seconds, after her eyes stopped believing in it. "What is that, Dad?" she asked, and for the first time in 11 months, her voice was not bright at all. I put my hand flat on the folder. "It is exactly what you think it is," I said. "Before I tell you what was inside that folder, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. What city, what state, what country. I read every single one. And if these stories mean something to you, take 1 second and hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who need it. To understand what happened at that Thanksgiving table, you have to go back 3 years, to the morning my wife's hospice nurse handed me a paper bag with Rosalind's reading glasses in it. My name is Samuel Whitfield. I am 71 years old. For 34 years I worked as a forensic structural engineer, which is a long way of saying I was the man they called after a building fell down. Not the man who designed it, not the man who built it, the man who came afterward, with a clipboard and a camera and a great deal of patience, and figured out exactly which small failure had started the whole thing. That is a very specific job. Most engineering is about making things stand up. My work was about understanding why they stopped. I spent 3 decades crawling through collapsed parking structures and burned-out warehouses and one very memorable pedestrian bridge in Ohio, looking for the crack that came first. Here is what 34 years taught me. Buildings almost never fall because of the big, obvious thing. Buildings fall because of a small defect that nobody bothered to look at, repeated quietly over a long period of time, until one ordinary Tuesday, the load finally exceeded what the compromised material could carry. The collapse is fast. The failure is slow. The failure is always slow. I would think about that a great deal in the 11 months I am about to describe to you. My wife was named Rosalind. We were married for 43 years. She was a high school music teacher for 29 of them, and she taught more than 4,000 children to read a treble clef. And at her funeral, a man in his 50s came up to me and said she was the only adult who ever told him he was good at something. He cried when he said it. He had driven 6 hours. Rosalind died on a Tuesday in March, at home, in the room with the good window, 3 years before that Thanksgiving. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end. It was completely brutal and entirely too fast, and there is nothing else to say about it that does not sound like a greeting card. We had one daughter. Her name is Claire. I want to be careful here, because it would be very easy for me to tell you this story, as though Claire was born wrong. She was not. I have thought about it more than any man should think about anything, and I can tell you honestly that Claire was a wonderful child. She was the kind of kid who noticed things. When she was 7, she informed me that our neighbor, Mr. Petrosian, was sad, and I asked her how she knew, and she said, because he stopped watering the yellow flowers, but he still waters the red ones. She was right. His wife had left him that spring. The yellow ones had been hers. That was Claire. Observant, quick, warm. She used to sit on the concrete steps of the house with a juice box and ask me to explain what made bridges stay up, and she would listen to the whole answer. All of it. She was 9 years old and she listened to the whole answer about tension and compression. I loved her completely. I love her still. That is the part people always find difficult when I tell them this story, and I have stopped apologizing for it. You can love someone entirely and still put a folder on the table. Claire married a man named Wesley Doran when she was 29. Wesley was in what he called wealth advisory. I asked him once what that meant precisely, and he talked for 4 minutes, and I understood almost nothing, which at the time I attributed to my own ignorance about finance. It was not my ignorance. I want to be clear about that now, 3 years too late. When a man talks for 4 minutes and you understand nothing, that is very rarely a failure of your comprehension. That is usually the entire point of the 4 minutes. Rosalind never warmed to Wesley. She never said anything unkind about him. Not once, not ever. But I noticed she stopped playing piano when he was in the house. She had played piano through everything else. Through her mother's death, through my knee surgery, through the 18 months I was unemployed in the 90s. She stopped playing when Wesley visited. I never asked her why. I have asked myself that question probably 400 times since. They had 2 children, Owen, who is 19 now, and a daughter, Nadia, who is 15. Good kids. Owen especially. He is going to matter later in this story, more than anyone expects, including him. For a long time, we were an ordinary family. Christmases and hospital visits, and one genuinely terrible camping trip in 2009. Wesley and I never became close, but we were polite, and I told myself that was enough. A father-in-law does not need to be loved. He needs to be present and reasonably pleasant and available with a truck when someone moves apartments. Then Rosalind got sick, and everything I thought was solid turned out to be load-bearing in ways I had never checked. The first 8 months after she died, Claire was extraordinary. I want that on the record. She came over 3 times a week. She learned to make the specific soup her mother made, the one with the barley, and she made it badly and kept making it until it was right. She sat with me in the room, with the good window, and did not fill the silence with anything. Grief makes you soft, in places you did not know were vulnerable. I understand that now, with a clarity I could have used at the time. When someone is the only person holding your hand in that period, they get access, not just to your heart, to your judgment, to your default assumptions about what is being asked of you, and why. That is not manipulation, necessarily. Sometimes it is just love. But it creates the same opening either way. And the difference between the two is a thing you often cannot see until much later, from a different angle, with better light. About 9 months after the funeral, Wesley started coming with her. It was gradual. First he came on a Sunday, because he happened to be nearby. Then he came on a Tuesday with a bag of pastries. Then he was there most times, sitting in Rosalind's chair, which he probably did not know was Rosalind's chair, because nobody had ever told him, and there was no sign. And Wesley started asking questions. They were not aggressive questions. That is what I want you to understand about how this works. Nobody sits down across from a grieving 70-year-old man and says, "Tell me about your assets." What Wesley said was, "Sam, I hate to be the guy who brings this up, but I do this for a living, and I would feel terrible if I did not at least ask whether you are protected." Protected. What a word that is. It sounds like a shield. It functions like a crowbar. I told him I was fine. He said, "Of course. Of course." He was sure I was. He just wanted me to know he was available. And then he asked, in the most casual tone imaginable, whether Rosalind and I had ever gotten around to updating the trust. I said we had a will. I said Frank Delgado drew it up in 1998 and updated it in 2016. Wesley made a face. It lasted about 1/3 of a second, and then it was gone and replaced with something pleasant. But I saw it. I have spent 34 years looking at hairline fractures in load-bearing concrete. I notice small things that appear briefly. and then get smoothed over. He said a will is fine. He said a will is absolutely fine for most people. He said, and I remember this exactly, the problem with a will is that it puts your family in front of a judge during the worst week of their lives. And then he let it sit there. He did not push. He changed the subject to Owen's soccer and asked if I wanted more coffee. That is the crack. Right there. That third of a second face, and that one sentence about the judge. I logged it and I dismissed it. And if you want to know the single greatest professional failure of my life, it is that I spent 34 years teaching junior engineers never to dismiss the anomaly, and then I dismissed the anomaly in my own dining room because I was tired and sad, and the man was married to my daughter. 4 months later, Claire brought me a folder. This is not the folder from Thanksgiving. This is a different folder, and I want you to hold both of them in your mind as this story goes, because the entire thing is about the difference between them. Claire's folder was navy blue with a plastic cover. Inside were 41 pages. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, with her hands flat on the wood, and she said, "Dad, Wesley and I have been talking, and we want to make this easy for you. Easy, protected. These are the words. If you are watching this, and someone in your life has recently started using these words about your money, sit up straight for the next few minutes." The 41 pages were a revocable living trust, my house, my retirement accounts, my brokerage account, and the small commercial property on Dunmore Street that Rosalind and I bought in 1991 and rented to a family who ran a print shop. All of it moved into a trust. The trustee was me. That is what she showed me. Page 4, halfway down. My own name. The successor trustee, in the event of my incapacity or death, was Claire. I read it. I want you to know that I read it. I sat there for 25 minutes and read all 41 pages while my daughter waited and made tea. And I did not understand a great deal of it because I am an engineer and not an estate attorney. But I understood the shape. And then I said something that I think about often. I said, I would like Frank to look at this. Claire's face did something. Not the third of a second thing Wesley did. Something slower and sadder. She said, "Dad, of course, absolutely, if that would make you comfortable." And then she said, I want you to know, it hurts a little, that you would need someone to check whether I am trying to hurt you. I want to pause here and tell you what that sentence does, because it is the most effective sentence in this entire story, and it was not even a lie. I believe Claire meant it. I believe it genuinely hurt her. That sentence converted a reasonable professional precaution into an emotional accusation. It took a document review and made it a referendum on whether I trusted my only child 4 months after burying her mother. And it worked. Not immediately. I did call Frank. Frank Delgado was 76 years old at that point, semi-retired, still taking a handful of old clients out of his home office in Belmore. I called him, and I described the trust, and he said, "Bring it by." I did not bring it by. Here is why. And I have never been able to make this sound like anything other than what it is. Claire called me the next evening, and she was crying, and she said she and Wesley had a fight about it, and Wesley said he felt like a criminal in his own father-in-law's house, and could we just table it? She did not want to fight about paperwork. She just wanted her dad. So I said fine. I said let us not fight. I said I will sign it, and we will never talk about this again. And I signed 41 pages on a Thursday afternoon in October, without a lawyer present, because my daughter cried on the telephone. That decision cost $1,940,000. I have done the arithmetic more than once. I signed at Wesley's office. That should have been my second warning, and it registered as a convenience. There was a notary there, a young woman named Bree with a lanyard, and there was a witness, one of Wesley's associates, whose name I did not catch, and who did not look at me once. Wesley said, "You are doing a great thing here, Sam." He shook my hand with both of his hands. Rosalind used to call that the salesman's clasp. She noticed it about a car dealer in 1987, and she never let go of the observation. I drove home and I felt genuinely relieved. That is the terrible part. I felt like I had taken care of something. For roughly 2 months, nothing happened. Then things started to change. And they changed so slowly that I could not have told you the day it started. The first thing was the mail. My bank statements stopped arriving. I noticed in January that I had not gotten the paper statement from Meridian Savings. And I called. And a very pleasant young man told me the account had been switched to paperless in December. I had not switched it to paperless. I said that. He said, "Well, sir, it shows a request from the account on December the 2nd. I asked him to switch it back. He said he could do that. 3 weeks later, no statement. I called again. Different person. Same answer. Request from the account. Now, let me tell you what a normal 70-year-old man thinks in that moment, because I was one. I thought I probably clicked something. I thought maybe I did it during that mess, when they changed the app. I thought, I am tired, and I am not as sharp about this technology business as I used to be, and I probably did this to myself. That is the exact thought the whole thing runs on. Every single elder financial exploitation case in this country runs on a version of that thought. The system does not need to fool you. It only needs you to be willing to blame yourself first. The second thing was Wesley's schedule. He started coming by on weekday mornings, alone. He would say he had a client in the area. He would bring coffee and sit in Rosalind's chair, and he would ask me how I was sleeping, and how the headaches were, and whether I had had any more of those moments. I had never mentioned any moments. I had never mentioned headaches. I did not have headaches. He would say things like, "Claire mentioned you got turned around on Vestry Road." And I would say, "I did not get turned around on Vestry Road." And he would say, "Okay, absolutely. I probably misheard her. Do not worry about it. Do not worry about it." Said to a man in his own kitchen, about a thing that never happened, 4 times in 5 weeks. The third thing was the strangest, and I did not understand it for almost half a year. In February, Claire asked me to come to a doctor's appointment with her. Not mine, hers. She said she was nervous about a follow-up, and she wanted company. Of course I went. She was my daughter, and she was nervous. The office was in a medical park in Oak Ridge, and it was not an office I had been to before, and the sign in the lobby directory said, "Cognitive and Behavioral Health Associates." Claire went in for 19 minutes. I sat in the waiting room. A woman came out and asked if I was Mr. Whitfield, and I said yes, and she said, "Would you mind coming back for just a moment? The doctor would like to say hello." I went back. There was a man in a cardigan named Dr. Prashad. He was pleasant and unhurried, and he asked me how I was doing since my wife passed, and I said, "As well as can be expected." He asked if I was eating. I said yes. He asked if I ever felt confused in familiar places, and I said no, and he wrote something down. He asked me to repeat 3 words: apple, table, penny. I repeated them. He asked me to count backward from 100 by 7s. I got to 58, and then I said, "I am sorry. Is this an examination?" And he said, "Oh, not at all. This is just a wellness conversation. Your daughter is worried about you, and I told her the best thing is usually just to talk." I said the 3 words again without being asked. Apple, table, penny. I said them because I was irritated, not because I was tested. He wrote something else down. I want you to understand that I walked out of that building and got in my car and drove home and thought about it for maybe 11 minutes total, and then let it go, because Claire said she was nervous about a follow-up, and I am her father, and that is what fathers do. 14 months later, I would read the note Dr. Prashad wrote that day. It said, in part, patient presented with mild difficulty on serial 7s, some perseveration on word recall task. Daughter reports increasing episodes of disorientation and poor financial judgment. Some perseveration on word recall task. That was me saying apple, table, penny a second time because I was annoyed. That is how it is done. Nobody lies outright. They arrange true things at a specific angle. The fourth thing was the Dunmore Street property, and this is where it stopped being a feeling and became a fact I could hold. The print shop on Dunmore Street had been rented to the Okonkwo family since 1996. Emmanuel Okonkwo ran it, and after his stroke, his daughter Adaeze took it over. They paid $3,200 a month, and they had never once been late in 28 years. Not once. In 2011 they were 4 days late, and Emmanuel drove to my house personally to apologize and brought a cake. In April, Adaeze called me. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, I am so sorry to bother you, but I wanted to ask about the new arrangement." I said, "What new arrangement?" There was a pause on that phone call that I will remember when I remember very little else. She said, "The man came in March. He said you had transferred management. He gave us a new account for the rent deposits. He said the rent is going to $8,400, starting in July, and if we cannot manage that, we should start looking. He said you needed the income because of your medical situation." My medical situation. I sat down on the third step of my own staircase, in my own house, and I said, "Adaeze, what did the man look like?" She described Wesley Doran perfectly, down to the watch. Now, I want to tell you exactly what I did next, because this is the hinge of the entire story, and it is the part that most people get wrong, and I do not say that with any superiority. I say it because I nearly got it wrong myself. What I wanted to do was drive to Wesley's office and put my hand through his door. What I wanted to do was call Claire and scream into the telephone until my voice broke. What I wanted to do was something immediate and loud and satisfying that would have lasted about 90 seconds and then destroyed every possibility of getting anything back. Here is what 34 years of forensic engineering had actually taught me, and it took me a full night to remember it. When you walk into a collapsed structure, the very first thing you want to do is start moving debris. Every instinct in your body says clear it, find the cause, get to the bottom. And every single forensic engineer who does that destroys the evidence of what happened. You do not touch it. You photograph it. You document position and orientation and relationship. You establish the state of the thing before anyone disturbs it. Because the moment you disturb it, you have no case, only a theory. I hung up with Adaeze at 4 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in April. I did not call my daughter. I did not call Wesley. I sat in the dark in the room with the good window until 9 at night, and then I got a legal pad, and I wrote at the top of the first page, "Document first. Do not disturb the scene." And underneath that I wrote a second line, and that second line is why this story ends the way it does. I wrote, "Let them keep believing the structure is failing," because they thought I was collapsing. Wesley had spent 5 months building a file that said I was collapsing. He had a doctor's note and a paperless statement request, and a story about Vestry Road. And a man who is collapsing is a man you stop watching closely. So I decided to collapse. The next morning, I called Claire, and I asked her, in a voice I made slightly slower than my own, whether she knew what happened to the mail. She said, "What mail, Dad?" I said, "I keep looking for envelopes, and they are not coming." And I said it with a small, confused laugh at the end, the kind of laugh a man makes when he is embarrassed about himself. There was a silence on that phone call. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. And then Claire said, in a voice that was gentle and warm and absolutely delighted. "Dad, do not worry about the mail. Wesley set it all up online. It is all handled. You do not have to think about any of it. You do not have to think about any of it." I said, "Okay, honey." I said, "Thank you." I said, "I feel silly." She said, "Do not feel silly." She said, "We love you." I hung up the phone, and I stood in my kitchen, and I understood, finally and completely, the size of what was happening in my life. Because Claire was not surprised. A daughter whose father calls confused about his mail is surprised. She was relieved. There is a specific brightness in a voice when someone has been dreading a conversation, and the conversation goes the easy way instead. I have heard it in depositions from contractors who thought I was going to ask about the rebar spacing, and instead, I asked about the weather. My daughter was in it, not a bystander, not a woman being fooled by her husband. In it. That was the worst hour of my life, and I include the hospice room in that comparison, because in the hospice room, I was losing someone who loved me, and in that kitchen, I was losing someone who did not. And then the hour ended, and I got to work. I want to walk you through exactly what I did over the next 7 months, in detail, because I know some of you watching are in the early part of your own version of this. And the single most useful thing I can give you is not the ending, it is the method. The first thing I did was create a war chest. This sounds dramatic. It was not dramatic. It was arithmetic. Everything I owned was now inside a trust where my daughter was successor trustee. If they ever got a court to declare me incapacitated, Claire would become trustee immediately, and every dollar would be under her control that same afternoon. Any money I had would evaporate exactly when I needed it most. But there were 2 things they did not have. The first was a credit union account at Harbor Point Federal that I had opened in 1979, 12 years before I met the man who would become my son-in-law, and which had never held more than $1,100. It existed because I had once needed a car loan and never closed it. It was not in the trust. It was not in any list Wesley had, because Wesley worked from a list I had given him, and I had forgotten this account existed when I made that list. The second was cash, actual physical currency. I had $3,400 in a coffee can in the crawl space, which Rosalind used to make fun of me for, and which I now understood to be the smartest thing I have ever done. Over 5 weeks, I moved money into Harbor Point Federal in small amounts, never more than $900 at a time, never on a predictable day. Some of it from Social Security direct deposit, which I redirected in a way that took me 4 phone calls and a great deal of pretending to be confused about routing numbers, which was useful cover, because a confused man asking about routing numbers is a very forgettable phone call. By the middle of June, I had $19,200 in an account nobody knew existed. That money bought everything that comes next in this story. If you take one practical thing from the next 2 hours, take that. Before you confront anyone, make sure you can pay for a lawyer without asking permission from the person you are about to confront. The second thing I did was get a real attorney. And here, I made a decision that felt like a betrayal and turned out to be essential. I did not call Frank Delgado. Frank was my friend for 30 years. Frank drew up my original will, and Frank was 76, semi-retired, working out of his sunroom, and known to my daughter as Dad's lawyer. If I called Frank, Claire would know within a week, not because Frank would tell her, because Claire had been in that sunroom, because Claire had Frank's number in her phone from arranging her mother's estate paperwork. Because the first thing anyone does when they suspect the target is moving is call the target's known associates and ask how he seems lately. So instead, I drove 40 minutes to Ridgefield, to a firm I found by sitting in a public library and using a library computer, because I no longer trusted my own devices. That is not paranoia, that is procedure. In March, Wesley had spent an entire afternoon at my house, helping me with a printer problem I did not have. The attorney was named Elena Cruz. She was 44 years old, and she had spent 9 years as a prosecutor in the elder abuse unit before going private. Her office had a plant that was clearly dying and a diploma that was clearly not. I sat down across from her, and I said, "My daughter and her husband have moved my property into a trust. They have taken over my rental income, and they are building a medical file to have me declared incompetent. I have no proof of any of it. I have one phone call from a tenant, and a bad feeling, and 34 years of reading structural failures." Elena Cruz did not react the way I expected. She did not gasp. She did not tell me she was sorry. She reached into a drawer, took out a legal pad and said, "Mr. Whitfield, tell me every single date you can remember, starting with the earliest thing that felt wrong, even if it felt wrong for no reason." We were there for 3 hours and 10 minutes. When we finished, she looked at her notes for a long moment. Then she said something I have quoted probably 100 times since. She said, "Most people come to me after the guardianship petition is filed. You came before. Do you understand how rare that is?" I said no. She said, "In 9 years in that unit, I saw maybe 4. Everyone else came in after they had already lost, and my job was damage control. You still have every option available to you, but you only keep them if you do exactly what I say for the next several months, and most of what I am going to say is going to feel like doing nothing." I said I have spent 34 years standing still in wreckage while everyone screamed at me to start digging. I can do nothing. She smiled for the first time. She said, "Then we are going to be fine." Here is what Elena laid out. Item 1. I was not to confront anyone. Not Claire, not Wesley, not once. Not even mildly. The moment they knew I was aware, they would either accelerate the guardianship petition or start destroying documents, and both outcomes were catastrophic. Item 2. I needed a neurological and psychiatric competency evaluation from a physician of my own choosing, immediately, done properly and formally, on the record. She explained why in a way that reorganized my understanding of the entire situation. She said, "Right now, there is exactly one medical document about your cognition in the world, and your son-in-law commissioned it. If a petition gets filed 6 months from now, a judge sees one note from Dr. Prashad describing disorientation and poor financial judgment, and nothing else. Judges are not detectives. They read what is in front of them." She said, "We are going to put a second document in front of them, a full workup, neuropsychological battery, MRI, the entire thing, dated before any petition, from a physician with no connection to your family, who will testify," she said. "And here is the part people miss. We do it now, while they still think you are declining. Because the value of that report is not that it says you are competent. The value is that it says you were competent on this date, 3 months before they claimed otherwise, and they did not know it existed." Item 3. Documentation. Everything. Photographs, not photocopies. Metadata intact. Originals never removed from where they belonged. Item 4. And she said this one twice. Under no circumstances was I to record a conversation I was not a participant in. I asked why. She said, "Because our state requires one-party consent, which means I could legally record any conversation I was part of. But if I planted a device to capture a conversation happening without me, I would commit a felony, and every single thing that flowed from it would be thrown out, and the case would go from theirs against mine to mine against mine." She said, "The fastest way to lose this is to get greedy about evidence." I wrote that down. I underlined it twice. Item 5. Time. She said this would take months. She said the case would not be won by finding one dramatic thing. It would be won by accumulating so much boring documentation that no reasonable person could construct an innocent explanation. She said, "Juries and judges are not persuaded by outrage, they are persuaded by volume." I understood that better than she knew. Nobody ever won a structural failure case with a photograph of the rubble. You win with 400 pages showing the same undersized bolt in the same wrong place, over and over, until the pattern is undeniable. I paid her a $4,000 retainer from Harbor Point Federal on a Thursday afternoon in June. Then I went home and I began the slowest, strangest, most disciplined 7 months of my entire life. The competency evaluation took place over 3 sessions in late June and early July at a neurology practice in Fairhaven, 65 minutes from my house, with a physician named Dr. Amara Osei. I want to describe this properly because I know some of you are wondering what it actually involves. It was not a man in a cardigan asking me to repeat 3 words. Session 1 was 2 hours and 40 minutes. Full neuropsychological battery administered by a technician, then reviewed by Dr. Osei. Verbal memory, delayed recall, executive function, processing speed, visuospatial reasoning, abstract reasoning, financial capacity assessment. That last one matters enormously, and almost nobody knows it exists. Financial capacity assessment is a formal instrument. They present you with a bank statement containing an error and see if you find it. They ask you to explain what a reverse mortgage is. They give you a scenario about a stranger asking for a wire transfer and ask what you would do. I found the error in the bank statement in about 40 seconds. It was a duplicated debit. Dr. Osei's technician made a small noise. Session 2 was the MRI and blood work. Ruling out vascular changes. Ruling out normal pressure hydrocephalus. Ruling out B12 deficiency and thyroid dysfunction. All the things that can mimic cognitive decline. Session 3 was Dr. Osei herself for 90 minutes, and it was the only part that was difficult, because she asked me why I was there, and I had to say it out loud, in a small office, with a diploma from Johns Hopkins on the wall, to a woman I had met twice. I said, "I believe my daughter and her husband are preparing to have me declared incompetent so they can take control of approximately $2 million in assets, and I need proof that on this date I was not." Dr. Osei was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Whitfield, I want to tell you something that I tell perhaps 10 patients a year. Have you heard of the term diagnostic overshadowing?" I said no. She said, "Once a person over 65 has any note in their file suggesting cognitive concern, every subsequent physician reads everything through that lens. You forget a word, and it becomes evidence. You get frustrated, and it becomes agitation. That note follows you, and it recruits every doctor you meet into confirming it." She said, "The note your family arranged is doing that right now. Today, we begin building the opposite." Her report came back on the 14th of August. It ran to 22 pages. I have read it more times than I would like to admit, and there is one sentence in it I have essentially memorized. Overall cognitive functioning falls in the high average to superior range for age, with financial capacity assessed as fully intact. There is no evidence of neurocognitive disorder of any type. Reported episodes of disorientation are not corroborated by any objective finding and warrant scrutiny as to their source. Dr. Amara Osei wrote that sentence in a clinical report in August, 4 months before anything happened at any dining table. Elena Cruz called me the day she received it. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, do you understand what you are holding?" I said, "I think so." She said, "You are holding the thing that ends this. Everything else we gather is now supporting material. This is the load-bearing wall." She used those words. I did not prompt her. I laughed out loud for the first time in months. Then she told me the thing I had not thought about. and it changed how I understood the entire remaining timeline. She said, "Now we file it nowhere." I said, "What?" She said, "This report goes in my safe and in your safe deposit box, and it does not get shown to a single human being until the moment it does maximum damage. If you show it to a doctor, it goes in a medical record. If a medical record exists, it is discoverable. If it is discoverable, your son-in-law's attorney finds it in 90 days, and the entire strategy changes." She said, "The value of this document is that they do not know it exists. The day they learn it exists, it becomes ordinary. Until then, it is a trapdoor." I asked her how many people knew. She said, 4. You, me, Dr. Osei, and her technician, who signed a confidentiality acknowledgement. And then she said, "Mr. Whitfield, this is where most people fail. Not at gathering, at holding." She was right about that. And I want to explain the specific temptation, because I felt it constantly for 3.5 months. When you have a document that proves you are not what someone says you are, every single day you want to produce it. There is a version of this story where I put Dr. Osei's report on the kitchen table in August, where I say to Claire, "Here, 22 pages, high average to superior. Now explain the doctor's appointment in February." And do you know what would have happened? Elena walked me through it in detail because I asked her to. She said, "Best case, they apologize, they blame a misunderstanding, they quietly unwind the deed transfer through a corrective filing, and you get your property back and nobody is charged." And she said, "That is the best case, and it happens maybe once out of 10. She said, "Worst case, they file the guardianship petition that week, before you have counsel of record, and before a prosecutor has ever heard your name, and you spend 11 months and $60,000 fighting an emergency guardianship with one doctor on each side, and a judge who has 40 cases that day." And she said, "And in every single one of those scenarios, Eugenia Wren loses her house because you never find out she exists." That was the argument that held me. Every time I wanted to slam the folder on the table in August, I thought about a woman whose name I did not yet know, so I held it. 94 days. In September, I did one more thing that turned out to matter, and it was Elena's idea, and I resisted it because it felt paranoid, even by the standards of what I was already doing. She had me establish a contemporaneous record of my own competence, weekly, in a form nobody could dispute. Every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, I recorded a voice memo, 3 to 5 minutes. In it, I stated the date, the day of the week, the current national news headlines from that morning's paper, the closing balance of the Harbor Point account, and a summary of everything I had done that week related to the case. 14 weeks of them, she said. If this ever goes in front of a judge, and someone claims you were declining during this period, we play 4 of these at random, and the argument ends. I did not enjoy making them. I felt ridiculous. A 71-year-old man talking to a telephone in an empty house about the weather. But here is the thing I noticed about halfway through, and I did not tell Elena about it for a long time. Those recordings were the only place in 11 months where I was not performing. Everywhere else I was a slightly confused man, who could not open jars. On Sunday evenings at 7, for 4 minutes, I was Samuel Whitfield, and I said what I actually thought, and there was no one to manage. In the 8th one, I said something at the end that I did not plan. I said, "I miss my wife, and I would like to tell her about all of this. I think she would be furious with me for signing those 41 pages, and I think she would be proud of me for the rest of it, and in that order, and she would say both things in the same afternoon. I have never played that one for anybody. Now I want to tell you about the performance, because the performance was the hardest thing I have ever done, and it lasted 5 months. Every week, I gave them a little more decline. Not dramatically. Never anything a person would remark on. I want to be very precise here, because I think people imagine this as theatrical. And theatrical is exactly what gets you caught. What I actually did was this. I stopped correcting people. When Wesley said Claire mentioned I had trouble with the stove, I no longer said that never happened. I said, did she? And I let it stand. An uncorrected claim becomes a shared fact within about 3 weeks. I watched it happen, in real time, with 4 separate fictions. I started asking for help with things I could obviously do, not everything. That would be noticed. Roughly 1 thing per visit. Wesley, would you mind? I cannot get this jar. Claire, can you read this to me? The print is small. I moved slower. Not a limp, not a shuffle. Just 3 or 4 seconds longer to get out of a chair. Human beings read speed as capacity, more than they read almost anything else. And I let my house get slightly worse. This was Elena's idea, and I fought her on it. 2 days of dishes in the sink instead of none. A newspaper stack that grew. Mail on the counter, unopened, which was easy since almost nothing came anymore. She said, "They need to walk out of your house feeling reassured. Reassured people do not check their assumptions." Meanwhile, at 4 and 5 in the morning, I did the actual work. I was up at 4:15 every day for 5 months. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not endurance. It is just what happens when you are 71 and something is happening to you. I photographed every document in my house. Every one. Deeds, statements going back to 2009, tax returns, the original 1998 will, the 2016 update, Rosalind's death certificate, the property records for Dunmore Street, the original 1991 purchase documents. Elena had been specific. Photograph, do not photocopy, and do not remove. A photograph carries metadata. It has a timestamp and a device signature, and it can be shown to have existed at a certain moment. A photocopy is a piece of paper that anyone could have made at any time. She had explained it to me, with an example that I found completely persuasive. She said, "Imagine you bring me a photocopy of a bank statement from 2019. Defense counsel asks when you made it, you say August. He asks how he can verify that. And you cannot, because a photocopier does not record anything about itself. Now imagine you bring me a photograph. That photograph knows the make and model of the device, the date, the time to the second, and in many cases the location. It is not a copy of a document. It is a record of an act of looking. A record of an act of looking." I wrote that down too. So I photographed everything, and I did it in a specific way, which she also specified. Each document got 3 photographs. One of the whole page, one of the signature block or any handwriting, and one of the document lying on my own kitchen table next to that morning's newspaper, so the date on the newspaper appeared in frame. That last one was Elena's idea, and I thought it was excessive until she explained that in 20% of her cases, opposing counsel had challenged the metadata itself as fabricated. By the end of July, I had 1,480 photographs. I want to describe what those mornings were actually like, because I think there is an image in people's heads of this kind of thing that involves excitement, and there was no excitement in it at all. It was 4:15 in the morning, in a house that was too quiet. It was a lamp on the kitchen table, and a cheap tablet, and my reading glasses, and a stack of paper. It was photographing the same kind of page, 400 times. It was my back hurting after 90 minutes, and standing up, and walking to the sink, and coming back. Some mornings, I found nothing. Most mornings, I found nothing. That is what people do not understand about investigation. And it is the same in structural forensics. You do not walk into a collapsed building and find the answer. You catalog 3,000 pieces of ordinary debris and on the fourth day, one of them is not ordinary, and you only know that because you have looked at the 3,000. In the second week of July, I went through the tax returns. Rosalind did our taxes for 30 years, and after she died, I switched to a preparer in town, a woman named Doreen Whitby, who has been doing returns out of a strip mall office since 1988. I had signed everything Doreen sent me without reading it, which I want to flag because it is exactly the behavior I am telling you not to have. The return from the previous year had a schedule attached that I did not recognize. It reported rental income from Dunmore Street of $19,200. The actual rental income from Dunmore Street that year was $38,400, $3,200 a month, 12 months, and the Okonkwo's had never once been late. Half of my rental income had not appeared on my own tax return. I drove to Doreen Whitby's office on a Wednesday, and I did not tell her anything about the situation. I asked her, in a slightly confused way, whether she could walk me through where the numbers on that schedule had come from. She pulled the file. She said, "Oh, this came from Wesley. He sent the summary in February. He said he was handling your books now." I said, "Did I sign anything authorizing that?" And Doreen Whitby, who has been doing this since 1988, went very quiet, and then she said, "Mr. Whitfield, I have a signed engagement letter here, designating him as your authorized representative. Would you like to see it?" I said yes. The signature was mine, and it was not mine. It was a good forgery. Better than the deed, actually. And I have thought about why, and I believe the deed was rushed, and this one was not. Doreen made me a copy without me asking. Then she said something I did not expect. She said, "I have been doing this for 36 years, and I want you to know that I am going to write down everything about this conversation today, with the date, and I am going to keep it, and if anyone ever needs it, you call me." There are more decent people in the world than these stories suggest. I want that in here somewhere. That engagement letter turned out to matter enormously, and not for the reason I expected. Elena explained it. She said, "A forged deed is one document, and a defense attorney can build a story around one document. Maybe there was a misunderstanding about authority. Maybe your father-in-law verbally authorized it and forgot. Juries are surprisingly willing to entertain that," she said. But two forged documents in two different contexts, 5 weeks apart, with two different purposes, is a pattern, and a pattern is not a misunderstanding. A pattern is a plan, she said. Get me a third one, and this stops being arguable at all. So I went looking for a third one. In the last week of July, I requested my full account histories from Meridian Savings, in person, at a branch in Fairhaven where I had never banked, because Elena said, "Do it at a location where nobody knows your family." It took 9 days and cost $31 in retrieval fees. They gave me a box, 18 months of statements, transaction by transaction. I sat at my kitchen table for 4 consecutive mornings with a legal pad and a calculator, and I went line by line, the way I used to go through inspection logs. Here is what I found. Between the previous December and June, there had been 11 withdrawals from my primary account that I could not account for. None of them was large. The largest was $4,200. The smallest was $800. The total was $26,900. Every single one was structured as a transfer to an account, ending in the same 4 digits. And here is the part that told me who I was actually dealing with. The withdrawals were never in the same week of the month. They were never on the same day of the week. They were never in round numbers. 4,200, not 4,000. 1,150, not 1,000. That is not somebody helping himself. That is somebody who knows what a fraud analyst's software flags. Wesley Doran had done this before. I did not have proof of that in July. I had the shape of it, which in my line of work is often what you get first, and which is usually right. I photographed all 18 months, 291 pages, 3 photographs each. Then I did something Elena had not asked for, and it turned out to be the single most useful thing I contributed to the entire case. I built a chart. I want to explain what this was, because it is the one place where my profession genuinely mattered. In structural forensics, the most powerful document you produce is never the narrative report. It is the timeline exhibit, a single page, chronological, where every event in the life of the structure is placed on one axis, and the pattern becomes visible to a person who is not an engineer. I have testified perhaps 30 times in my career, and I can tell you that juries do not follow testimony. They follow the exhibit. So I built one for myself. One sheet of paper, taped to a second sheet, then a third, until it ran nearly 5 feet across my kitchen table. Left to right, every date I could establish. The trust signing in October, the paperless request on December the 2nd, the formation of Ashgrove on January the 28th, the Prashad appointment on February the 4th, the forged deed on February the 11th, the engagement letter with Doreen on February the 16th, the rent redirection in March, the first unexplained withdrawal in December, and the 10 that followed. And under each date, in a second row, what I had been doing, what I had been told, what I had believed at the time. The chart is where I stopped being angry and started being certain, because when you see it laid out, you cannot maintain the idea that anything about it was improvised. There is a 9-day gap between the formation of a shell company and a doctor's appointment I was walked into under a pretext. There is a 7-day gap between that appointment and a forged deed. Nobody drifts into that sequence. That sequence was designed, and it was designed before Christmas. I brought the chart to Elena in the first week of August. It did not fit on her desk. We put it on the floor and stood over it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "Mr. Whitfield, I am going to have this professionally reproduced, and I am going to show it to a prosecutor, and I am going to tell them that the victim built it." I said, "Does that matter?" She said, "It is going to be the most important thing in the room." I did not understand what she meant until October. Meanwhile, the performance continued, and it got harder, not easier. I want to talk about that honestly, because I think the difficulty of it is underrated by everyone who has not done it. In August, Nadia had a school orchestra concert. 14 years old, second violin. I went. Claire and Wesley were there. I sat with them, and Nadia played a piece my wife used to teach, and I had to sit next to 2 people who were stealing from me, and be a slightly confused old man about it. Afterward, Nadia hugged me and said, "Grandpa, did you like it?" And I said, "Your grandmother taught that piece for 20 years. And Nadia said, "Really?" And I said, "Really?" And she cried a little. And Claire watched that whole exchange with an expression of complete tenderness. On the drive home, I pulled over twice. Not because I was upset in a way that would have been visible to anyone. Because I did not trust myself on a road. There was a night in late August when I nearly ended it. I want to be honest about that, because I think these stories are dishonest when they skip it. Not ended my life. Ended the operation. I picked up the telephone at 11 at night, and I got as far as Claire's name on the screen, and what I wanted to say was, I know everything. Please, just tell me why." That is what I wanted. Not justice. An explanation. From my kid. I sat with the phone in my hand for probably 20 minutes. What stopped me was not discipline. It was a specific memory. I remembered a call I got in 1996 from a site supervisor in Trenton. He had found a problem, a real one, and he wanted to tell the contractor immediately, that day, because he liked the contractor, and he thought the man deserved to hear it from him. I told him not to. I told him to document it first, and he was angry with me, And he said, "These are people, Sam, not a case file." And I said, "That is exactly why. Because if you tell him today, he fixes it quietly, and nobody ever knows how it got there, and next year he does it again on somebody else's building." That contractor had done it on 4 other buildings. We found out in November. I put the phone down. Elena had a phrase for what I was going through, and she used it in September when I told her I was struggling. She said, "You are in the load hold." She had gotten that from me, from something I said in June, and she had kept it. The load hold is the period in a test when you have applied the design load to a structure, and you simply wait. You do not add anything. You do not remove anything. You watch the instruments and you wait, sometimes for 24 hours, to see whether anything moves. It is the most boring part of any test, and it is where all the information is. She said, "You are holding a load. It is heavy, and it is not going to get lighter, and the only thing you have to do is not move." I said, "For how long?" She said, "Until the prosecutor tells us. Probably 90 days. It was 94. I bought a cheap tablet with cash at a store, 40 minutes away, and I never connected it to my home network. Everything went onto that tablet, and then onto 2 encrypted drives, one of which lived in a safe deposit box at Harbor Point Federal, opened under my name only, at a branch my family did not know I used. Then I started on the harder material. I requested certified copies of the deed records for Dunmore Street from the county recorder. That cost $11 and took 9 days. When they arrived, I sat at my kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning, and I discovered the second crime, though I did not understand its full size, for another 2 months. The deed to Dunmore Street had been transferred in February, not into my trust, out of it. The property was now held by an entity called Ashgrove Holdings, LLC. I had never heard of Ashgrove Holdings. The transfer document bore a signature, my signature, dated February 11th, notarized by a notary named Bree Sandoval. Bree, the young woman with the lanyard at Wesley's office. And on February 11th, I had been in Charleston, South Carolina, at the wedding of my late wife's nephew, 460 miles away, in a hotel, with a keycard log and a credit card receipt, and 130 photographs of me on other people's phones. I sat in my kitchen in the dark, and I looked at that document for a very long time. Then I did something that surprised me. I did not feel rage. I felt the thing I used to feel at 2 in the morning, in a collapsed structure, when the beam of my flashlight finally landed on the failure point. Recognition. Cold, clean recognition. Because a forged deed is not a family dispute. A forged deed is a felony, with a number attached to it. Forgery of a real property instrument, uttering a forged instrument. And a notary who stamped it is a notary with a bond and a license, and an enormous amount to lose. Wesley Doran had just handed me the one thing I did not have. He had handed me a co-conspirator with less to lose than he did. And every prosecutor in America will tell you that is how these cases get made. I called Elena Cruz at 8 that morning. I said, "I need to see you today." She moved 2 appointments. When I put the certified deed copy and my hotel receipt from Charleston on her desk, she looked at them for perhaps 40 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Mr. Whitfield, I need you to understand that this is no longer a civil matter." She said the case had crossed a line. Civil fraud is a lawsuit. Forgery of a deed is a criminal charge, and it is not a charge that gets pled down to nothing. And the presence of a licensed notary makes it a case a prosecutor will actually want. Then she said, "And now we have to be even slower." I said, "I have been slow for 4 months." She said, "And now it gets harder, because from this point forward, you have something worth stealing. If they get any sense that you have that deed copy, they will move." She explained what moving would look like. an emergency guardianship petition, filed ex parte, which means without me present. In our state, a court can appoint a temporary guardian in as little as 72 hours if there is an allegation of imminent financial harm. My daughter would file it. She would attach Dr. Prashad's note. She would describe a father who was giving money away and could not manage his affairs. And Elena said, "If that happens, you will be in a hearing trying to prove you are competent," which is the single most difficult thing to prove in a courtroom, because every emotional word out of your mouth becomes evidence against you. She said, "That is why we build until it is undeniable, and then we go to the prosecutor, not the family." So I went back to my house, and I kept collapsing. July became August. August became September. Wesley came by on Tuesday mornings with coffee, and I got slower and vaguer, and one morning I called him by the wrong name and watched something like relief cross his face. In September, Elena filed a public records request with the Secretary of State for the formation documents of Ashgrove Holdings, LLC. That is a $9 request that any citizen can make about any registered entity in this country, and it is the single most underused tool in existence. Ashgrove Holdings, LLC, was formed on the 28th of January of that year. Registered agent, a service company in Delaware, sole managing member, listed on the formation documents in plain text, Wesley Doran, and there was a second name, on a filing amendment from March, listing an additional member, Claire Whitfield Doran. I looked at my daughter's name on that document, at a kitchen table where she had eaten every breakfast of her childhood, and I did not cry. I want to tell you that I cried, because it would make me sound like a better father. I did not. What I felt was a kind of finality. The load calculation was complete. There was no arrangement of the numbers that gave me a different answer. Elena and I went to see the county prosecutor's office in the first week of October. This is a part of the process nobody talks about, so let me tell you how it actually went, because it was not dramatic and it was not fast. We met an assistant district attorney named Priya Raghunathan, 39 years old, who handled financial crimes. We were in a conference room with bad lighting for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Elena presented the file in a specific order that she had spent a week arranging. Not the forged deed first. That was the surprise to me. She led with Dr. Osei's competency report. 22 pages, establishing that on the 14th of August, Samuel Whitfield had cognitive functioning in the high average to superior range and fully intact financial capacity. Then Dr. Prashad's note, obtained through a formal medical records request I had made in my own name, as is my right. Then the two documents side by side. Elena said, "This is not a case about whether Mr. Whitfield is confused. This is a case about a family that manufactured a medical record." And Raghunathan sat forward. Only then did Elena produce the deed, the forged transfer, the Charleston Hotel folio, the credit card receipt from a restaurant on King Street, time-stamped 7:52, in the evening, on February 11th, 460 miles from the notary's stamp. Raghunathan looked at the notary's name for a long moment. Then she said, "How old is Miss Sandoval?" Elena said, 26. Raghunathan said, "And how long has she been commissioned?" Elena said, 14 months. And Raghunathan closed the folder and said, "We are going to want to talk to Miss Sandoval. Here is what I learned in that conference room, and it is worth the price of admission on this entire story. These cases are almost never made against the person who planned them. They are made against the person who helped for a small amount of money and did not fully understand what they were part of. A 26-year-old notary with 14 months of commission and $140,000 in student loans does not go to prison for a man who paid her $400. Raghunathan told us it would take time. She said financial crimes take 8 to 14 months to build properly. She said she would not move until she could charge everything at once, because charging piecemeal lets defendants coordinate their stories. And then she said, the thing that made me understand the shape of the ending. She said, Mr. Whitfield, I want you to keep doing what you have been doing. Do not change anything. Do not warn them. And if there is a natural occasion in the coming months where the family will all be present, tell us. I said, Thanksgiving. She wrote it on a legal pad and underlined it. Now, October and November were the worst part. And I want to be honest about that. Because I think stories like this skip the waiting, and the waiting is the whole thing. 7 weeks of eating dinner with people who were stealing from me. 7 weeks of my daughter kissing my forehead when she left. There was a Sunday in October when Claire came alone. Wesley was in Chicago. She brought the barley soup, the one her mother made, and she had finally gotten it right. And we sat in the room with the good window, and she talked about Nadia's school. And she said, Dad, I know things have been hard. I know you have not been yourself. And I want you to know that whatever happens, I am going to take care of you. And she meant it. That is the thing I cannot get past, even now. My daughter looked at me and told me she was going to take care of me, and inside her own head, that was true. She had constructed a version of events where taking my house and my accounts and forging my name on a deed was a form of caretaking, where I was declining, and she was protecting the assets from my poor judgment, and everything she was doing was hard but necessary. People do not steal from their parents while thinking of themselves as thieves. They build a story first. The story is always about protection. I said, "Thank you, honey," and she hugged me, and I hugged her back, and I meant it too, which is the part I still do not fully understand. In early November, Owen came to see me, my grandson, 19 years old, home from his first semester at Rutgers, 6'2", and still not entirely sure what to do with his hands. He came alone, on a Thursday, which had never happened before. He sat in my kitchen, and did not drink the coffee I made him, and finally he said, "Grandpa, can I ask you something weird?" I said, "Always." He said, "Are you okay? Like actually?" And I said, "What makes you ask?" And Owen Doran, 19 years old, said the sentence that turned this entire case from strong to unassailable. He said, "Because Dad had me help him with something in March, and I did not think about it at the time, and now I keep thinking about it." I put my coffee down very carefully. I said, "What did he ask you to help with?" Owen said his dad had asked him to drive some paperwork to an office. And in the car, Wesley had taken a phone call on speaker, and he had not been careful, because it was just Owen. And on that call, Wesley had said, and Owen repeated it to me almost exactly, that the old man is not going to notice anything, and even if he does, nobody is going to believe him by February. Nobody is going to believe him by February. I sat with my 19-year-old grandson at my kitchen table, and I made a decision in about 4 seconds that I have never once regretted. I told him the truth, all of it. Elena Cruz was furious with me. She used the phrase, catastrophic risk. She was completely right, and I would do it again, because Owen had come to me with a question, and if I had lied to that boy to protect a legal strategy, I would have been doing to him a smaller version of what his parents were doing to me. Owen did not cry. He sat very still for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" I said nothing. I said absolutely nothing, and I meant it. I said, "You are 19, and these are your parents, and there is no version of this where you help me that does not cost you something you cannot get back." And Owen said, "Grandpa, he had me drive the forged deed. I am already in it." He was right. And that is the thing about these schemes. They metastasize. They pull in notaries and children and doctors, and everyone who touches them ends up holding something. Owen gave a voluntary statement to Ade Raghunathan on the 11th of November, recorded, with counsel present, counsel that I paid for, out of Harbor Point Federal, because I was not going to let that boy do that alone. The last piece came 4 days later, and it came from Wesley himself. This is the part where the confession happens, and I want to be exact about the circumstances, because Elena had drilled it into me for 6 months. I did not plant a device. I did not hide a recorder. What happened was this. On the 15th of November, Wesley and Claire came for dinner. During dinner, Wesley asked to use my office to take a call. My office is directly above the dining room, and the house was built in 1962, and the heating vent in that office opens into a duct that runs down to the dining room register. I had known that for 29 years. Rosalind and I used to joke about it. She could hear me on the phone with contractors from the dining room table, every word, and she would tell me afterward when I had been too polite to someone who did not deserve it. Wesley did not know. Why would he? Claire was in the kitchen. I was alone at the dining room table, and I took out my phone, which was in my pocket, in my own house, at my own table, and I pressed record on a conversation I could hear, with my own unassisted ears, in the room I was sitting in. Elena had told me this exact scenario was legal. I was a participant in the environment. It was my property, and there was no expectation of privacy in a conversation audible in a common room. She had told me twice. She had told me not to go looking for it, but if it happened, to press record and not to move. I did not move. I sat at that table for 11 minutes. Wesley was talking to someone he called Grant. I have the transcript. I have read it in a courtroom. Here is the substance. He said the guardianship petition was drafted and ready, and they were filing the first week of January, because the holidays would make it look worse for me. A man alone, family concerned. He said Prashad would sign a supporting affidavit for $2,000. He said Dunmore was already clean and had been since February, and there was nothing to trace, because the old man had not looked at a deed record in 30 years and would not know where to start. And then he said the sentence that ended his life, as he had constructed it. He said, Claire is fine. She has fully talked herself into it. She thinks she is saving him. And this Grant said something I could not hear, and Wesley laughed and said, no, the beautiful part is, he trusts her completely. He signed 41 pages because she cried on the phone. That is the whole security system, one phone call. I sat at my mother-in-law's dining table, in the house where I raised my daughter, and I listened to a man explain that my love for my child was a security vulnerability he had exploited. 11 minutes and 40 seconds. When Wesley came downstairs, I asked him if he wanted more potatoes. He said, no thanks, Sam. He put his hand on my shoulder as he sat down. He said, you doing okay, buddy? I said, I get tired. He said, I know. We are going to take care of everything. Everyone laughed about something Nadia said. Claire refilled my water without me asking, and I sat there with a recording in my pocket that would send that man to prison, and I ate my potatoes, and I said nothing at all. That was the 9th day of the last 2 weeks of my life as a man who was being stolen from. Elena and Raghunathan spent the following week doing the thing that actually wins cases, which is boring beyond description. Grant Holloway was identified within 48 hours from Wesley's phone records, which the prosecutor's office had by then obtained by warrant. Holloway was a 51-year-old former broker who had surrendered his securities license in 2018, and when they ran Grant Holloway, the case got bigger than me. Because Holloway and Wesley Doran had done this before. That is the second betrayal layer, and I did not learn the size of it until the week before Thanksgiving. Ashgrove Holdings was not built for me. Ashgrove Holdings was built in January, 3 weeks before my deed was forged, and by the time investigators finished it, held 4 properties. One was Dunmore Street, The other 3 had belonged to Eugenia Wren, 83, of Marlow Heights, to Dennis Achterberg, 79, of the same county, and to a woman named Ruth Beckham, 81, who had died in April, 7 weeks after signing a document she almost certainly did not read. Elena told me this in her office on the 19th of November, and I did not speak for almost a full minute. Then I said, "How did nobody catch this?" And she said, "Mr. Whitfield, they did not catch it because there was nobody to catch it. Mrs. Wren has no children. Mr. Achterberg has a son in Portugal. Mrs. Beckham died. This is the entire business model. They do not find rich people. They find isolated people." And she said, "You were supposed to be one of them. You had a wife who died, and a daughter who was your whole world. From the outside, you were perfect." I asked her how they found them. Not how they stole from them, how they found them in the first place. Elena said that was the question Raghunathan's office had spent 3 weeks on, and the answer was worse than either of us expected. Obituaries. That is it. That is the whole intake system. Grant Holloway subscribed to a data service that aggregates published death notices by county and cross-references them against property records. It is a legal service. It is marketed to real estate investors, and to estate liquidators, and to charities, and it costs about $90 a month. You put in a county. It gives you every recently deceased person, their surviving spouse, if named in the obituary, and whether that surviving spouse owns property in their own name. Rosalind's obituary ran in the county paper on the 19th of March. It said she was survived by her husband of 43 years, Samuel Whitfield, and their daughter Claire. I was on a list within a week of my wife's funeral. Not because anyone knew me, because I appeared in a database as a category. Widower, owns property. Age 71. Elena said Holloway ran the list monthly and scored it. He was not looking for money. He was looking for isolation. An obituary that mentions many children and grandchildren scores low. An obituary that mentions one child, or no children, scores high. Ruth Beckham's obituary named nobody but a late husband. She scored highest of all 4. I sat in Elena's office, and I thought about the fact that the last public document about my wife's life had been used as a targeting instrument, and I had to get up and stand at the window for a minute. Elena let me. She did not say anything comforting, which I appreciated. When I sat down, I said, "So what is the connection to Wesley? Holloway finds them, and then what?" And Elena explained the division of labor. And this is the part that I think everyone watching should understand, because it is the actual mechanism. Holloway found targets. Holloway had no way to reach them. A stranger cannot approach a widower and get access to a deed. Wesley provided the approach. Not always as a son-in-law. That was only me. In the other 3 cases, Wesley Doran approached as a financial advisor, offering a free retirement review, through a seminar program he ran at 3 community centers and a church hall in 2 counties. Free lunch seminars, 2 hours, a sandwich tray, a slideshow about outliving your savings. Eugenia Wren attended one, in October of the previous year, at a senior center in Marlow Heights. There were 31 people in that room. Wesley did a presentation about the risks of probate, and he offered free, one-on-one consultations, and 11 people signed up. Elena had the sign-in sheet. It had been obtained by subpoena from the senior center, which had kept it in a file cabinet for no particular reason. 31 names. I read every one of them. 11 of those people had a private meeting with Wesley Doran. 4 of them signed something. 3 of those 4 lost a house. And the 4th was a man named Dennis Achterberg. And Dennis Achterberg was the reason this whole thing was going to be provable in front of a jury. Because Dennis Achterberg, 79, retired postal supervisor, had done something none of the rest of us did. He had taken notes. Elena told me about him in the 3rd week of November, And I asked to meet him, and she said absolutely not. Not until after charges. And she was right. And I waited. But she read me his notes. Dennis Achterberg had gone to that seminar and taken a legal pad and written down, in the way that a man who supervised a postal facility for 31 years writes things down, the date, the time, the room, the presenter's name, and the substance of what was said. And then when he had his one-on-one meeting, he took notes on that too. 9 pages. And on page 6 he had written a line that Raghunathan later put on a screen in a courtroom in a font large enough to read from the back row. He had written, "WD says trust protects from probate." Asked him if I keep control. He said, "Yes, I remain trustee." Asked, "What happens if I get sick?" He changed subject. Asked twice. Changed subject twice. Asked twice. Changed subject twice. A 79-year-old retired postal supervisor wrote that on a legal pad in October and put it in a drawer, and it became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case, because it established that Wesley Doran knowingly avoided disclosing the incapacity provision to a client who directly asked about it. Twice. Dennis Achterberg signed nothing that day. He went home and thought about it and decided he did not like a man who would not answer a question. He signed 6 weeks later, in December, after Wesley called him 4 times, and after a second man, who Achterberg described in his notes as an associate named Grant, joined a call and told him the paperwork was routine. He wrote that down too. He wrote the date of every call. Elena said, "Mr. Whitfield, you built a 5-foot chart on your kitchen table." Mr. Achterberg built one in a spiral notebook without knowing he was doing it. Between the two of you, this case has a spine. I have thought about Dennis Achterberg a great deal since. He was not suspicious. He was not clever. He did not sense a scheme. He was just a man who had spent his working life in an organization where you write down what happened, because someday someone is going to ask, and the answer better not be, "I think so." That habit saved his house, and it helped save mine. So if you are watching this, and you are wondering what the practical takeaway is, before I get to the ending, it is that. It is not vigilance. It is not paranoia. It is a legal pad, and the date at the top. Now let me tell you about the waiting. Because between the 19th of November and Thanksgiving, there were 8 days, and those 8 days were the longest of the entire 11 months. Raghunathan had told us to change nothing. Change nothing means having a normal week. On the 20th, Claire called me about the Thanksgiving grocery order and asked whether I wanted the sausage stuffing or the chestnut one. I said sausage. She said, "Good. Me too. Mom always did chestnut, and I have never liked it." On the 21st, Wesley came by with coffee. He sat in Rosalind's chair. He asked me how I was sleeping, and I said not well. And he said, "You know, Sam, after the holidays, I think we should get you in front of someone about that." After the holidays. He was telling me his timeline to my face, and he did not know it. On the 23rd, Owen called me. He had given his statement 12 days earlier, and he had told nobody. He was 19 years old, living in his parents' house on winter break, carrying that. He said, "Grandpa, I do not think I can eat dinner at that table." And I said, "Yes, you can, and here is why." I said, "In 4 days, your father is going to be arrested, and your mother is going to be arrested. And for the rest of your life, you are going to be the person who knew. If you are not in that room, you will spend 40 years wondering whether you should have been." I said, "Sit next to me. You do not have to say a word. You just have to be there." He said, "Okay." He asked me one more thing before he hung up. He said, "Is Mom going to jail?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay." And then he said, "Thank you for not lying to me." And he hung up. That is what that boy got out of this. He got the truth, and it cost him his family, and he thanked me for it. On the 25th, Elena called with the final logistics, and she told me the thing I had been dreading. She said, "Priya wants you to know that she cannot control what the children see." She said, "We will make it as quiet as we can. No weapons drawn. Nobody handcuffed inside the house if it can be avoided. But it is an arrest, and Nadia is 15, and she is going to be in that building." I said, "Is there any other way?" And Elena Cruz, who had been a prosecutor in the elder abuse unit for 9 years, told me the truth, which is why I hired her. She said, "There is. We could do it on a Tuesday at his office. Nadia would be at school," she said. "But if we do that, Wesley calls his attorney within the hour, and your daughter is advised by that attorney within 2 hours, and she does not cooperate. And if she does not cooperate, Holloway's prior entities never get identified, and 19 victims stay at 4. She said, "Cooperation happens in the first 90 seconds. It happens when a person is surrounded by everyone they love and has just watched their own child hear the evidence. It does not happen in a conference room with counsel present." She said, "That is the actual reason for Thanksgiving. Not drama, not your satisfaction. It is because your daughter is the only route to 15 other victims. And there is exactly one moment where she breaks, and that moment is at that table." I asked her to say it plainly. She said, plainly, "We are going to traumatize your granddaughter in order to recover property for people she will never meet." I sat with that, and I said yes. I have never told Nadia that. She is 17 now. Someday she will ask me the direct question, because she asks direct questions, and I will tell her the truth, and I do not know what she will do with it. That is the cost. I want it in this story. These endings get told as though the good outcome is free. It was not free. Somebody paid for it, and she was 15 years old, and she was not consulted. I asked Elena, at the end of that call, "What happens to those 3 other people now?" She said, "That depends entirely on whether a case gets made. And a case gets made when someone with documentation and a competency report and a recording walks into a prosecutor's office." She said, "You are not just getting your house back, you understand that." I said, "I do now." Eugenia Wren was 83 years old, and she had lost a house on Marlow Heights that she and her husband bought in 1974. She had not lost it in a market crash or to a hurricane. She had lost it to a man in a good suit who was pleasant on the telephone, and she did not know. That is what I could not get past. Nobody had told her yet, because the investigation was ongoing, and telling her would compromise it. That week I stopped thinking about Thanksgiving as my reckoning. I want to be honest about what I had been imagining before that. I had been imagining something small and clean and personal. My daughter's face. Wesley in handcuffs on my lawn. Something I had earned. And then I learned about 3 strangers, and one of them was dead, and my private catharsis started to look like a very small building next to a very large one. Elena called me on the 22nd. She said Raghunathan had made a decision. She said, "They are ready to charge." The grand jury returned indictments under seal on Wednesday. 6 defendants. 6. Wesley Doran, Grant Holloway, Bree Sandoval, Dr. Anand Prasad, a woman named Lorraine Fickett, who was a paralegal at a title company and had processed all 4 transfers, and Claire Whitfield Doran. I said her name out loud, as a question. And Elena said, "Yes," and then she said, "Mr. Whitfield, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear the whole sentence before you respond." She said, "ADA Raghunathan is willing to structure the timing around Thanksgiving, not for theater, because you have 6 defendants who have never been in a room together with law enforcement present, and because 2 of them, Sandoval and your daughter, are the ones most likely to cooperate, and cooperation happens in the first 90 seconds or it does not happen at all, she said. But you need to decide something first, and you need to decide it tonight. She said, do you want your daughter charged? I did not answer that night. Elena did not expect me to. I sat in the room with the good window from 8 in the evening until nearly 4 in the morning, and I am going to tell you what I thought about, because it is the only part of this story that I think might actually help someone. I thought about the fact that I could stop it. That was real. Elena had been clear. Raghunathan had discretion. If I told her that Claire had been manipulated by her husband, if I said that she was a secondary participant who did not understand the criminal nature of what she was signing, there was a path where my daughter was a witness instead of a defendant. That path existed. It was available. All I had to do was tell a story with a slightly different emphasis. And I sat there, and I ran the numbers the way I have run numbers my entire professional life. Here is what I kept coming back to. In 2007, I was retained on a case involving a parking structure in Delaware County. 6 levels, precast, built in 1998. A section of the 3rd level failed on a Sunday morning and dropped 11 vehicles onto the 2nd level. Nobody was killed, which was pure luck, because on a weekday, that structure held 400 cars. I found the cause in 9 days. Undersized bearing pads on a specific run of double T beams. The specification called for 1 thickness. The installed pads were a different thickness, roughly 240 of them, across the whole structure. And here is the part that mattered. The site engineer had noticed. In 2001, he had written it in a report, and he had characterized it as a minor deviation, not affecting performance, because the structure was standing, and it had been standing for 3 years, and the cost of correcting 240 bearing pads in an occupied structure was enormous. He was not a bad man. I met him. He was 62 and devastated, and he had a photograph of his grandchildren on his desk. He had made a decision to describe a real defect in gentler language, because the consequences of describing it accurately were expensive and painful. 6 years later, the 3rd level came down. I sat in the room with the good window, and I understood that Elena Cruz was offering me the opportunity to describe a real defect in gentler language, and that the consequences of accuracy were expensive and painful, and that I very badly wanted to take it. And then I thought about Eugenia Wren, because if my daughter walked, my daughter's testimony walked with her. A cooperating witness who has been promised no charges is a witness the defense destroys in 11 minutes. But a defendant who pleads and cooperates with exposure on her own charges is a witness who is credible, because she is testifying against her own interest. The 3 other victims did not have a competency report and a recording. They had my daughter. That is what decided it. Not justice, exactly. Not principle. Arithmetic about 3 strangers. I called Elena at 7 in the morning, and I said, charge her. And then I said one more thing, and Elena told me later that this was the sentence Raghunathan repeated to her whole unit. I said, but I want her to have the chance to make it right, and I want that chance to be real. If she cooperates fully, I will support any consideration the office wants to give her. I am not asking for her to be destroyed. I am asking for her to be accountable. Those are different, and I want them treated differently. Elena was quiet. Then she said, Mr. Whitfield, in 9 years in the elder abuse unit, I never once heard a victim make that distinction. Thanksgiving was the 27th. 18 people. Claire had organized it, at my house, which she had begun doing 3 years earlier, under the reasonable premise that I should not have to cook. Wesley and Claire, Owen and Nadia, my sister-in-law Marguerite and her husband Dale, Claire's friend Paige and her family, Wesley's mother Priscilla, who is 80 and lovely and knew nothing, some cousins, 2 neighbors, and, at the far end of the driveway from 2 in the afternoon, in a gray sedan, 2 investigators from the county prosecutor's office, plus ADA Priya Raghunathan in a second vehicle, and 4 sheriff's deputies staged at a church parking lot 1 mile away. The plan was specific. Elena had walked me through it 4 times. I would place the folder on the table. I would say a small number of things. I would not accuse anyone of a crime, because that was not my job, and doing it wrong could compromise the arrests. I would keep everyone in the room. When I finished, I would take out my phone and send a blank text message to Elena Cruz, and then I would put my hands in my lap and let the professionals work. I got up at 4:15 that morning, out of habit. I made coffee. I sat in the room with the good window, and I watched it get light. I thought about Rosalind for a long time. I thought about her at the piano, and the way she stopped playing when Wesley came. And I said out loud, in an empty house, "I am sorry. It took me so long to hear what you were not saying." Then I got the folder out of the safe deposit box copy I kept at home, which was a duplicate, because the originals were with Elena and with the prosecutor, and I was not going to have a document destroyed at a dinner table. The folder was plain manila, 14 documents. I had arranged them in the order Elena arranged them for Raghunathan. Because that order worked. People started arriving at 2. Claire hugged me in the doorway and said, "Dad, you look tired. Are you sleeping?" And I said not much, which was true. Wesley shook my hand with both of his, the salesman's clasp. He said, "Big day, Sam." He had no idea. Dinner was at 4. My dining table seats 12, and we had added the folding table at the end, and there were 18 people, in a room built for a family of 3, and it was loud and warm, and it smelled like my wife's kitchen, even though my wife had been dead for 3 years. I want to tell you that I did not enjoy it. I did enjoy it. That is the strangest thing I can report from that day. For about 40 minutes I sat at the head of my own table, with my grandchildren and my sister-in-law and my neighbors, and it was Thanksgiving, and it was good. Owen sat directly to my left. He had asked to. He did not eat much. At about 10 minutes to 5, Claire stood up. She had a glass of Prosecco in her hand, and she tapped it with a fork, which she has done at every family gathering since she was 15 years old. She said, "I just want to say something quick." And the room quieted. Because people quiet for Claire. She has that. She has always had that. She said, "This has been a really hard few years for our family. We lost Mom, and Dad has been so strong, but it has been hard, and there have been a lot of changes, and I think we are all just adjusting." She looked at me, and her eyes were wet, and I believe every single one of those tears was real. She said, "But I feel like we are turning a corner. I feel like next year is going to be different. Wesley and I have been working on some things to make sure this family is protected, and I really think, that this is the start of something better." And she raised her glass. She said, "To new beginnings." 18 people raised their glasses. Wesley raised his highest. He was smiling at his wife, with what I can only describe as pride, and I understood in that moment that he was proud of her, that in his mind she had performed beautifully, that the toast was groundwork for a January filing, and he thought she had just delivered it perfectly to a room full of future character witnesses. That is what that toast was. Every person at that table was going to be told in January that Grandpa was declining, and every one of them was going to remember that Claire had said so at Thanksgiving, gently and lovingly, before anything happened. It was extremely well done. I want to give her that. And I reached under my chair and I took out the folder, and I set it on the tablecloth between the turkey and the cranberry sauce. The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in pieces. Claire's smile stayed on her face, a full 3 seconds after her eyes stopped believing in it. She said, "What is that, Dad?" I put my hand flat on the folder. I said, "It is exactly what you think it is." Nobody moved. Marguerite had a serving spoon in her hand, and she did not put it down for the entire next 4 minutes. Wesley said, "Sam," and he was still smiling. "What have you got there, buddy?" And I looked at him and I said, "Wesley, sit down." He was already sitting. He sat down again anyway. Something in his body understood before his face did. I said, "I am going to talk for a few minutes. I would like everyone to stay where they are. Nobody is in danger, and nobody is going to be shouted at. I do not shout." I opened the folder. I said, "The first document in here is a neuropsychological evaluation performed on me over 3 sessions in June and July of this year by Dr. Amara Osei of Fairhaven Neurology. 22 pages. It concludes that my cognitive functioning is in the high average to superior range for my age, and that my financial capacity is fully intact." I said, "I paid for it myself. Nobody in this room knew about it." Claire said, "Dad, what? Why would you?" I held up my hand. Not angrily, just up. I said, "The second document is a note written on the 4th of February by a Dr. Anand Prasad at Cognitive and Behavioral Health Associates. Following a 19-minute conversation, I was brought into, under the impression that I was accompanying my daughter to her own appointment, and I read one line out loud. Daughter reports increasing episodes of disorientation and poor financial judgment. I looked at Claire. I said, "You told a doctor I was disoriented, in February, and then you drove me home, and we got sandwiches." My daughter did not say anything. She put her glass down on the table, and she did it very carefully, the way you do when your hands have stopped being reliable. Wesley said, "Okay, Sam, I think this is a conversation for another time. This is not appropriate in front of." And I said, "Wesley, the third document is a certified copy of a deed transfer for the property at 1140 Dunmore Street, dated February 11th, transferring the property from my trust to an entity called Ashgrove Holdings, LLC. I said, "It bears my signature. It is notarized by Bree Sandoval." And I took out the fourth document. I said, "This is a hotel folio from the Wentworth in Charleston, South Carolina, for the nights of February 10th through 12th. And this is a receipt from a restaurant on King Street, time-stamped 7:52 in the evening on February 11th. And there are 130 photographs of me at Danny's wedding on that date, on the phones of several people currently sitting at this table." I said, "I was 460 miles away when I signed that deed." Marguerite made a small sound. Wesley stood up. I said, "Sit down." And I want to describe my own voice at this moment, because it surprised me. It was not loud. It was the voice I used in depositions for 34 years. Flat, unhurried, entirely certain. I said, "Wesley, there are 2 investigators from the county prosecutor's office, parked at the end of my driveway. They have been there since 2 o'clock. If you go out that door, you will meet them in my yard in front of my grandchildren. I am giving you the opportunity to not do that." He sat down. I kept going. I said, "The 5th document is the formation filing for Ashgrove Holdings, LLC, filed on the 28th of January with the Secretary of State, sole managing member, Wesley Doran." I said, "The 6th document is an amendment filed in March, adding a 2nd member." And I turned it around so the table could see it. And I did not read the name out loud, because she was my daughter, and she was sitting 8 feet from her own children. Claire read her name and put her hand over her mouth. Nadia said, "Mom," and Claire said nothing. I said, "The 7th document is a transcript of an 11-minute conversation recorded in this house on the 15th of November, in this room, at this table, on my own telephone, while a call was taking place in my office, directly above us, through a heating duct that has carried sound in this house since 1962. Wesley's face changed color. I have never seen anything like it before or since. It went from red to a kind of gray in what felt like under 2 seconds. I said, I am not going to read most of it. Priscilla is at this table, and Nadia is 15, and there are things in it that nobody should have to hear. And that was true. And it was also the only cruelty I permitted myself, because leaving it unread made it enormous. But I read one line. I said, "At 4 minutes and 10 seconds. In reference to me, you said, the beautiful part is he trusts her completely. He signed 41 pages because she cried on the phone. That is the whole security system. One phone call." I set the paper down. The silence in that room had a physical weight to it. I have been in buildings after a collapse. It is that silence, the one where a great deal of noise has just stopped. And then Claire said, in a voice I had not heard since she was about 11 years old, "Dad." "Just that. Just Dad," I said. "I know." She said, "It was not. I did not. Dad. It was supposed to be protection," I thought. And I said the thing I had been preparing for 6 months, and it was the only sentence I got emotional on, and my voice cracked in the middle of it, and I let it. I said, "Claire, I know you believe that. I know you built something in your head where this was care. But sweetheart, you sat with a doctor in February and described a man who does not exist, and then you came to my house and ate soup with me." I said, "The 8th document is a formation record showing that Ashgrove Holdings currently holds 4 properties. One of them is mine. The other 3 belong to Eugenia Wren, who is 83, Dennis Ochterberg, who is 79, and Ruth Beckham, who was 81, and who died in April, 7 weeks after signing something." I said, "Mrs. Beckham did not have a father with a folder." And that is when Claire started crying, and it was not the crying from the phone call about the 41 pages. It was different. I have thought about it for a long time, and I believe the difference was that for the first time she was seeing the actual shape of the thing she was inside. Wesley said, "Claire, do not say anything. Do not say one more word." And I said, "And that is the 9th document, Wesley. It is a printout of your call log for the 14th of November, showing a 9-minute call with Grant Halloway, whose securities license was surrendered in 2018. And then I did the only theatrical thing in this entire story, and I am not proud of it, and I would do it again." I closed the folder and I said, "That is not everything that is in here. That is 9 of 14. Then I took out my phone, and I sent a blank text message to Elena Cruz, and I put my hands in my lap. It took 90 seconds. I counted, because counting was something to do. The doorbell rang, which I had not expected. I had expected something louder. But Ada, Priya Raghunathan, is a professional, and there were 2 children in that house. And so a woman in a gray coat rang my doorbell on Thanksgiving Day and waited to be let in. Owen answered it. He looked at me first, and I nodded, and he got up and answered the door. Raghunathan came in with 2 investigators. 4 deputies came in behind them, 1 minute later, and they did not have weapons drawn, and nobody yelled anything. She stood at the entrance to my dining room, and she said, "Good afternoon. I am Priya Raghunathan, with the county prosecutor's office. I need to speak with Wesley Doran and Claire Doran. Everyone else, please remain seated." Priscilla Doran, 80 years old, said, "What is happening?" in a voice that broke my heart, because she was Wesley's mother, and she had brought a pie. Wesley did not run. I think part of me expected him to. He stood up and he said, "I want a lawyer." And Raghunathan said, "Absolutely, sir. That is your right." And then he looked at me, directly at me, across my own dining table, and he said the last words he has ever said to me. He said, "You were confused." Not a question, almost a complaint, as though I had violated the terms of an agreement. And I said, "Wesley, I have spent 34 years figuring out why buildings fall down. You did not build anything. You just found something old that people had stopped looking at, and hoped nobody checked the load path. He was arrested in my front hallway, under the coat rack Rosalind bought in 1994. Claire was arrested on my front porch. She did not resist, and she did not speak. She looked back at me once. I looked back. And I want to tell you what I said, because a lot of you are going to have opinions about it. I said, I love you. Tell them the truth. All of it. That is what I said to my daughter, as she was walked to a county vehicle on Thanksgiving Day. Bree Sandoval was arrested that evening at her apartment. Grant Holloway was arrested the next morning at a hotel in Cherry Hill, where investigators believed he was preparing to leave the state. Dr. Anand Prasad was arrested on the Monday after Thanksgiving, in his office, between appointments. Lorraine Fickett, the title company paralegal, surrendered voluntarily with her attorney on the 2nd of December. 6 arrests inside 5 days. Now, I promised you consequences with numbers attached, and here they are, because I think vagueness at the end of a story like this is a kind of lie. Bree Sandoval cooperated within 4 hours. 4 hours. Elena had predicted 6. She gave a complete statement describing 11 notarizations she performed on documents where the signatory was not present, dating back 19 months, in exchange for payments totaling $3,200. $3,200. That is what my house was worth to her, along with 3 other people's houses. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of notarial misconduct and 1 count of conspiracy to commit forgery. She was sentenced to 18 months, of which she served 11. Her notary commission was permanently revoked, and she is barred for life from any position of financial trust in this state. I did not ask for leniency for her, and I did not ask for severity. She was 26, and she made a choice, and 11 months is 11 months. Dr. Anand Prasad went to trial. He was the only one who did, and I have never fully understood why. He was convicted on 11 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of medical records, and healthcare fraud related to billing for the 19-minute conversation that generated my note. The evidence at trial established that he had produced supporting documentation in 14 cases across 6 years, at a rate of between $1,500 and $4,000 per file. 14 cases, not 4, 14. He was sentenced to 7 years. His medical license was permanently revoked by the state board in a proceeding that took 19 minutes. The state medical board's written finding included a line that I have kept a copy of. It said his conduct represented a fundamental inversion of the physician's role, using diagnostic authority as a weapon against the patient it was meant to protect. Lorraine Fickett received 3 years probation, 400 hours of community service, and a permanent bar from the title industry. She was, by every account including mine, the least culpable person charged. She processed paperwork and did not ask questions she should have asked. She also testified for 2 full days, and her testimony is the reason the property chain was provable. Grant Holloway was the one who surprised me, because when the federal side got involved, and they did in January, it turned out Ash Grove was Holloway's 4th entity. There had been 3 others, in 2 other states, going back to 2013. The final count across all jurisdictions was 19 victims and approximately $6,100,000. 19 people. Most of them widowed. The oldest was 91. Grant Holloway pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 14 years and ordered to pay restitution of $6,100,000, which he will never pay, because it is gone. Wesley Doran pleaded guilty on the 9th of April, 3 weeks before his trial date, after Claire agreed to testify against him. Let me say that again, because it is the entire architecture of this outcome. Wesley Doran pleaded guilty because my daughter agreed to testify against him. He pleaded to conspiracy, to commit fraud, forgery of a real property instrument, uttering a forged instrument, criminal attempt at fraudulent guardianship, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, which in our state carries an enhancement when the victim is over 65. He was sentenced to 11 years. He will serve a minimum of 8 years and 4 months before he is eligible. He was ordered to pay restitution of $1,940,000, jointly and severally with Holloway. He is barred permanently from any fiduciary or financial advisory role in any capacity in this country. Claire Whitfield Doran pleaded guilty on the 22nd of January to 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud and 1 count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She cooperated completely, not partially, completely. She gave investigators 11 separate interviews over 5 weeks, totaling more than 30 hours. She provided passwords, account histories, text message archives she had not deleted, and a detailed timeline that allowed the prosecutor's office to identify Eugenia Wren and Dennis Achterberg's transfers and freeze them before they were sold. Her testimony in the Prashad trial lasted 6 hours across 2 days. She was destroyed on cross-examination in ways that were difficult to watch, and she kept answering. At her sentencing on the 14th of June, I did something that surprised the courtroom and that Elena advised me against. I gave a victim impact statement, and I asked the court for consideration. I stood at a podium 10 feet from my daughter, and I said, "Your Honor, I am the victim in this case, and I am also her father, and I have thought carefully about whether those two things are in conflict. I have decided they are not," I said. My daughter did a terrible thing. She did it knowingly. I am not here to tell you she was confused or coerced, because she was neither, and she has not claimed to be, I said. But 3 other families are getting their property back because of what she chose to do after she was caught. Eugenia Wren is 83 years old, and she is going to die in her own house on Marlow Heights, and that is because of my daughter's cooperation, and I do not think that should count for nothing, I said. I am asking the court to sentence her to a term that reflects both what she did and what she did afterward. Claire was sentenced to 4 years, with eligibility at 20 months. She was also permanently barred from serving as a fiduciary, trustee, or holder of power of attorney for any person, which is the consequence that I believe will matter most to her for the rest of her life. She served 22 months. She was released in April of the following year. Now let me tell you the numbers on my side of it, because you deserve the accounting. The Dunmore Street deed was voided by court order on the 8th of January, on the grounds that a forged instrument conveys nothing. The property returned to me clean. Adayeze Okonkwo's print shop is still there, and her rent is still $3,200 a month, and it will be as long as I own the building. The trust was rescinded in full in March, on grounds of fraudulent inducement and constructive fraud by a fiduciary. My house came back to me, along with my retirement accounts and my brokerage account, total recovered. Between the voided deed, the rescinded trust, and restitution actually collected from asset seizures, rather than promised on paper. $1,940,000 in assets restored, plus $216,000 in actual cash recovered from seized accounts. The other 3 properties were recovered as well. Eugenia Wren's title was restored on the 3rd of February. Dennis Achterberg's on the 11th. Ruth Beckham's went to her estate, which passed to a nephew in Tucson who had not spoken to her in 9 years, and who, when the county called him, thought it was a scam and hung up twice. 6 months after Thanksgiving, I drove to Marlow Heights, and I met Eugenia Wren. She made me tea in a cup that did not match its saucer, and she showed me a photograph of her husband, who died in 2004, and she said, "I did not know." That is the part I keep saying to everyone. I did not know anything was wrong. And I said, Mrs. Wren, that is not a failure on your part. That is the whole design. She held my hand for a while, and neither of us said anything, and that was fine. Here is what I did with the money. $216,000 in cash came back to me. I kept 40,000 of it, because I am 71, and my roof is 31 years old, and I am not a saint. The rest went into something I set up in September of that year, with Elena Cruz's help. It is called the Rosalind Whitfield Fund for Music Education, and it exists at the public school district, where my wife taught for 29 years. And I want to explain why it is what it is. Because I thought about it for a long time. I could have funded elder abuse prevention. That would have made sense. That is the obvious choice, and several people suggested it. But Rosalind did not care about that. Rosalind cared about a specific thing, which was that no child in her building should be prevented from playing an instrument because their family could not rent one. She spent 29 years fighting a battle over roughly $400 a year per kid. She wrote letters. She ran fundraisers with cookies. In 2004, she paid for a cello out of our checking account and did not tell me for 6 months, and when I found out we had the only real fight of our marriage, and I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong before the fight was even over. The Rosalind Whitfield Fund pays instrument rental, repair, and lesson fees for any student in that district whose family cannot afford them. No application essay, no committee. A music teacher submits a name, and the fund pays. It has funded 171 students so far. Last spring, I went to the district's end-of-year concert. I sat in the back of an auditorium with terrible acoustics, and I listened to a middle school orchestra play Dvorak badly, and there was a girl in the second row of the violins playing on an instrument my wife's fund paid for, and she was concentrating so hard that her whole face was screwed up with it. Rosalind would have known her name. Rosalind would have known her name, and her sister's name, and what she wanted to be when she grew up. I sat in the back, and I did not make a sound, and it was the first time since March of that terrible year that I felt like I had done something my wife would have actually wanted. Now let me tell you the part people always ask about. Claire came home in April. She served 22 months. She had lost her marriage because she filed for divorce from a state facility in the 7th month, and she had lost her house, which was sold as part of restitution, and she had lost her career, and she had 2 children who had spent almost 2 years being asked about it at school. Owen picked her up. 19 years old when this started, 22 by then, in his last semester. He drove her to my house, because there was nowhere else. I want to be extremely careful about how I describe what has happened since, because I do not want anyone watching this to hear a fairy tale. It is not fixed. It will never be fixed. There is no version of the rest of my life where I do not know what my daughter did. She lives in the apartment over my garage. She pays me rent, $400 a month, which she insisted on, and which I take, because Elena told me something in June of that year that I have never forgotten. Elena said, "If you refuse her money, you will be doing to her exactly what she did to you. You will be deciding that she is not competent to be an adult. So I take the $400. She works at a garden center in Ridgefield. She is good at it. She has a permanent record, and there are not many doors open to her, and she does not complain about it. Not once, not ever, which I notice. We have dinner on Sundays. Not always. Some Sundays one of us is not up to it, and we say so. And that is allowed now, which it never was before. She does not have access to my finances. She will never have access to my finances. My successor trustee is a licensed fiduciary in Belmore who charges me $1,400 a year and whom I have never met socially and never will. Claire helped me draft that document. She sat at my kitchen table and read the paragraph that names a stranger instead of her. And she said, "That is right. That is how it should be." Something happened last November that I want to end on. Nadia turned 17. We had a small dinner, 6 people. Owen came home for it, and Claire cooked, and I sat at the same table. And partway through, Nadia said, out of nowhere, "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" And she said, "How did you know? Like, how did you actually know something was wrong?" And everybody at that table went very still, because Claire was sitting right there, and this was the first time any of the grandchildren had asked about it directly, at a family meal. And I said, "Honey, I did not know. I noticed." I said, "There is a difference, and it is the most important difference in my entire profession. Knowing is a conclusion. Noticing is just refusing to explain something away." I said, "I noticed that a man made a face for a third of a second in 2021, and I explained it away. I noticed my statements stopped coming, and I explained it away. I noticed that a doctor asked me to count backward from 100, and I explained it away." I said, "I explained things away for 11 months, and I only stopped because a woman named Adaize called me about rent." I said, "So if you want the honest answer, I did not know anything. I just eventually got tired enough to stop making excuses for what I could see." And Nadia said, "That is kind of dark, Grandpa." And everyone laughed, including Claire, and the moment released. But she was right, and I have thought about it since. And I want to give you the less dark version, because it is also true. I was underestimated. That was the whole thing. Wesley Doran looked at a 71-year-old widower in a house with dishes in the sink, and he saw a structure at the end of its service life. Something that was going to come down anyway. So why not be the one standing there when it did? He never once considered that the man in the chair had spent 34 years in the wreckage of buildings that other men swore could not fall. I did not get faster. I did not get louder. I got patient, and patient is what I have always been. And patient is not the same thing as harmless. Those two get confused constantly, and the confusion is expensive. There is an old lion in a park near my house, on a stone gatepost, carved sometime around 1910. Rosalind used to say he looked bored. She said that for 40 years. He is worn down, and his face is soft with weather, and he is lying flat with his paws out in front of him, and he does look bored. He also has claws. They are right there. Everyone walks past them. I still get up at 4:15. I do not need to anymore, but the body keeps what it learns. And on Sunday mornings I sit in the room with the good window. And sometimes at about 10 o'clock, I hear my daughter's footsteps on the stairs from the garage apartment, and she comes over, and we have coffee, and we talk about the garden center, and about Owen's job, and about nothing at all. That is not forgiveness. Exactly. I am not sure what it is. Elena asked me about it once, and I told her I do not have a word for it, and she said maybe you do not need one. What I do have is this: my house, my name on my own deed, a fund with my wife's name on it that has put instruments in the hands of 171 children, 3 strangers who kept their homes, a grandson who came to me with a hard question when he was 19 years old and did the right thing at enormous personal cost, a granddaughter who asks me direct questions at dinner, and a daughter who pays me $400 a month and looks me in the eye when she does it. That is what was left standing. And here is the last thing I have to say about it, and then I will let you go. They spent 11 months telling everyone I was failing. They should have remembered what I did for a living. I spent 34 years being called in after everything came down, and I never once found a building that fell because it was old. They fall because somebody stopped inspecting. So look at your own paperwork this week. Read the pages. Ask the question that feels rude to ask. And if somebody tells you not to worry about it, worry about it. The old lion on the gatepost has been lying there for 116 years, and everyone who walks by assumes he is asleep. He is not asleep. He is just waiting for someone to get close enough to be worth standing up for. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and tell me if you have ever been the person nobody thought was paying attention. I read every one. Hit like, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next story.